So, as mentioned in my first presentation, my name is Grace Woods, and I'm beginning my second year in my MDiv program this fall at Garrett, and I'm a certified candidate in the United Methodist Church on the deacon track, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers. Today, we address seeking racial justice in the United Methodist Church with the question, what are the strategies in the UMC that they may adopt to live up to Article 5 of the Constitution? Because there is not a chapter from Questions for the 21st Century Church addressing this topic directly, I will explore this question further, mainly from the context of the Book of Discipline and the Book of Resolutions. So first, we'll examine Article 5 itself, address the issue that this question raises, consider 3 different strategies that are rooted in the Book of Resolutions to help United Methodists live up to Article 5, discuss an attempt at a solution, and offer questions for you all to engage in. So in the United Methodist Constitution, in the first part of the Book of Discipline, Article 5 says this. Article 5, Racial Justice, the United Methodist Church proclaims the value of each person as a unique child of God and commits itself to the healing and wholeness of all persons. The United Methodist Church recognizes that the sin of racism has been destructive to its unity throughout its history. Racism continues to cause painful division and marginalization. The United Methodist Church shall confront and seek to eliminate racism, whether in organizations or in individuals, in every facet of its life and in society at large. The United Methodist Church shall work collaboratively with others to address concerns that threaten the cause of racial justice at all times and in all places. So I took this opportunity to find out more information about the historical background of Article 5, and from what I could tell by reading the Constitution of the 1968 discipline, this article is not part of the founding documents of the UMC from the 1968 merger between the Methodist Church and the Evangelical United Brethren. In this version of the Book of Discipline, there is no Article 5 from 1968. The closest thing to touch on the content of Article 5 addressing racial injustice is the inclusivity statement in Article 4 of the 1968 discipline. And to be clear, Article 4 does exist as an inclusivity statement in later editions of the Book of Discipline. But in some ways, Article 5 is an extension to Article 4, and Article 4 discusses the inclusiveness of the church without regard to race, color, national origin, or economic condition, and says all shall be eligible to participate within the church. So this is important when we consider the central jurisdiction. And as we are learning in James Thomas's book, Methodism's Racial Dilemma, the formation of the central jurisdiction in 1939 highlights the need for Article 5 in the future. The formation of the central jurisdiction made segregation official church policy by creating a conference based on race and not geography, which you can see in this map here. And with that considered, there's a stark contrast between the segregation of the central jurisdiction, the 1968 writings of inclusivity in that Article 4, and what Article 5 says today in our modern use of the discipline. And what's most shocking to me is that, from what I can tell, in the limited resources I have this summer from our summer class online, is that Article 5 was not added until a constitutional amendment in 2001. So it did not exist prior to then. It took us over 62 years to have a distinct statement addressing racial injustice. I think that fact alone should strongly be considered when answering this question today and prefacing our presentation and how we engage with these questions. So our issue at hand, in my opinion, that is raised from this question is fairly obvious. We are collectively failing to proclaim the value of Black lives, and colored lives in general, placing limitations on the healing and wholeness of all God's children. This is demonstrated through the systematic racism in the United States, the need for concern from the church to seek racial justice. It's hit a boiling point. And I would go as far to say that we have failed, especially in the past year, by remedying this justice with mercy solutions rather than a justice approach, using a generic Martin Luther King quote and calling for us to love all God's children is simply not enough. never was enough, and it's especially not enough now. So if we really take a look inside of our local churches and examine the approaches we are taking, are we putting a Band-Aid on racial injustice, or are we seeking justice by healing the system in place? So let me be clear that I do not want to pretend that racism is not a complex issue and that I have all the right answers as a white woman. The strategies that I will discuss are not groundbreaking ideas. They are answers from within our own doctrine. And have you ever listened to the theology of someone within our Methodist church realm and thought, does this person even know that we have a book of discipline or a book of resolutions or what's in it? Because their theology is so far removed from the Wesleyan grace-based theology that we know and love. My point is that we often need to be reminded of our doctrine and of who we really are as United Methodists to fulfill our purpose in the most authentic way. And with that said, I want to look at these three areas, these three different strategy areas with you all briefly in hopes that they inspire us to living up to Article 5 in a new way. The hopes of our own doctrine can be a strategy in itself if we shift our perspective. So first is our environmental racism, then criminalizing communities of color, and lastly, the responsibility of the United Methodist Church. So our first strategy, environmental racism in the United States, is addressed in the Book of Resolution in a way that explains the issue and states how the United Methodist Church is responsible. Specifically, it brings up the unethical practice of toxic dumping of hazardous products, the lack of assistance from the government when building resilience after natural disasters, the displacement of Native peoples, the impact of climate change in communities of color, and many more. One way to turn this topic into a strategy is to help the UMC live up to Article 5 is to take further actions and expand this aid outside of the church. If these causes are truly important to the UMC, as they should be, then the solution should be more than just making sure the council of bishops, conferences, and local churches keep environmental racism in mind when addressing topics of environment or environmental justice or topics of racial justice. They should be covered in both realms. To be clear, I know that our church does serve the world in many areas more broadly. What is concerning to me instead is that the strategy is based on something different and how this topic is specifically addressed in the Book of Resolutions. So our second strategy is criminalizing communities of color. And this is rooted in the act of criminalizing the communities of color because as of 2016, the Book of Resolutions spends time exploring the need to stop criminalizing communities of color in the US. And this happens via economic crisis, waging war on communities of color, targeting migrants, mass incarceration, impacts on women and children, ending the torture of solitary confinement and ongoing punishment after incarceration. And while each of these subcategories are important and unique in their own struggle, each are also a product of white people in the US feeling in some way superior by othering communities of color. We must come to terms with the fact that the vastness of theologies in the United Methodist Church, within the US at least alone, does not lean exclusively left or right. And while division among politics is rarely the answer, the stubbornly woven strands of politics is rarely the stubbornly woven strands of politics and human rights leave us no other choice. At least in my experience growing up in rural Kansas and during a very build the wall Trump era for the last 4 years, I find myself really troubled with the conflict of conservative Christianity, including that among United Methodists. So my second strategy to upholding Article 5 is to educate our own parishioners on the political stances the United Methodist Church has taken on human rights. And while I'm not suggesting that we try to give many of our conservative members reasons to leave the church, we must consider how it impacts our theology. Is this a negative because it waters down our theology by not having all of our church members fully backing several of our responses to human rights issues? Or is it a positive for our intentional inclusivity? And this, I think, digs deeper if you actually read what the Book of Resolution says on this and the very specific backings in terms of immigration and things that are not typically part of the conservative agenda. So the third strategy ties our first two strategies together in terms of holding the church responsible and educating the church from within. It is from the perspective of the annual conferences, districts, and local congregations and their responsibilities for the eradication of racism. This section of the book of resolutions is less specific compared to the other two areas, basically just saying that every level of the United Methodist Church is required to be committed to eradicating racism. In the beginning of this section gives the reason for the eradication of racism because exclusively that our church is becoming more diverse, predicting that the population of persons of European descent will be less than 50% before 2050. It does not focus on the realities of the treatment of people of color, just the fact that we will all eventually become not less white. And while his point is valid, it denies the real reason why we should be fighting racism, the reasons pointed out in Article 5. If our concern is exclusive to what the majority of the church will someday become, this paints the picture that minorities are even larger outcasts, and more importantly, the people outside the church are outcasts as well. And with this considered, the third strategy to uphold Article 5 is to shift our focus from what the church will look like and how God's children are cared for. If we spent the same amount of energy as we do to make sure our marketing pamphlets include an array of racial diversity, as we did addressing racial injustice at the source, the eradication of racism may come much more quickly. The desperation for this issue shows through the words from Black Methodists for church renewal in response to George Floyd's murder last year, in addition to all the protests. They say, "We can no longer hold our tongues, no more than we can hold our breath. We have told the world in the church of our weariness from the incessant injustices that result from wars on us and any efforts we engage to overcome centuries of abuse in this country." I think that really frames our last strategy well and gives us meaning again to why this is important. So what we have touched on so far is, of course, just the tip of the iceberg. This complex issue cannot be addressed simply by three strategies, but instead will take time, persistence, hard collective work, and a solution as complex as the issue itself. So in addition to refreshing our minds of what the issue is, I wanted to restate our solutions as the strategies that we mentioned before. So my attempt at a solution are the three strategies I've offered, which are: one, taking further actions and expanding aid to exist outside of the church. Two, educating our own parishioners on the political stances the United Methodist Church has taken on human rights. And three, shifting our focus from what the church will look like to how God's children are cared for. So in addition to the questions for you all to engage with, I invite you to share your thoughts on these solutions. Please point out where I am wrong or what I have missed and what you envision as a strategy to uphold Article 5. The questions for you all today are: in your opinion, what area of environmental racism should the UMC focus its efforts on, or in order to make the most impact? And the second question is it problematic to have a range of theologies within the UMC like we do about the political human rights issues, like the criminalization of communities of colors, the criminalization of communities of color? And lastly, in what ways have your local churches engaged in topics of racial justice in the past year? I think it's great to hear what we have done, get inspiration and ideas of what we can do, and try to brainstorm and grow stronger in that way together. So thank you very much for following along. I appreciate you sticking it out, the last presentation of the semester. And here are my sources. Thank you very much.